in place of my good friend John Huntsman, Governor Huntsman, with my good friend Mark Penn. It's great to welcome Raj Shah to No Labels Radio here on Sirius XM 124. Dr. Raj Shah, who until last week actually, was the head of the United States Agency for International Development. Dr. Shah was known for doing lots of things under this period of time and the Obama administration, but when I think of you, Raj, I think of you as being a leader who not only brought innovation to USAID, which needed it terribly, but you invited partnerships with the private sector. You got focused on investment. You reached beyond what was normally the area of economic development, and you said, we got to do it with others. But more importantly, which is very close to No Labels, I think when people look back at your time, they think of the fact that you reached across the aisle and you built coalitions. I mean, Lindsey Graham, Senator Graham, and others are huge supporters of USAID and the work that it's done because of you. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, because when we're hearing all this gridlock in Washington and we hear about all these things that happen in our nation's capital or doesn't happen in our nation's capital, we don't have many examples of leaders like yourself who actually spend a good deal of time across the aisle working and building those coalitions. And I'd love to know where those origins came from and building those coalitions, and then what you managed to accomplish. I also remember attending the National Prayer Breakfast where you were the keynote a couple of years ago, and leaders from both sides of the aisle sang your praises. So I'd love to hear you talk about that coalition and what and why you did it. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Alan. Thanks for having me. You know, I'm excited because I think American foreign policy is a natural area where we should have more bipartisan cooperation around some very basic concepts that so many members of the aisle on both sides agree to. In my case, the concept that brought people together was very simple, that America is an exceptional nation. We are stronger and more prosperous when our foreign policy reflects our core basic values. And in that context, I am proud of the fact that I was able to work with very conservative, faith-driven Republican members of the Senate and very liberal, social justice-driven members of the House, bring them all together and say, let's do something big like tackle global hunger and malnutrition. That's just one area where we were able to dramatically increase America's investment, work with more than 70 private companies, and encourage nearly $10 billion of private investments in African economies and Asian economies. And as a result, we've seen more than 7 million farm households reached, more than 12 million children who would go hungry today are no longer malnourished, not because we've given out any food or pursued a handouts approach, but because we've helped them stand on their own 2 feet. And I've seen America's Congress come together across bipartisan divides to make that kind of extraordinary commitment of America's values really visible around the world.
I mean, the results obviously are clear. The numbers of those who are no longer in deep poverty are improving and better. You built these coalitions. I'm curious how much of this was also a process of building relations and really sitting down and breaking bread with members of Congress that normally wouldn't have been contacted by someone in your position, and how much of it was the agenda only? Because I think you always had a great agenda and a great purpose at USAID. You obviously built different partnerships and you've gotten to different results because of what you've done. But how much of that is also that sitting down one-on-one and talking to people?
Well, I think Washington needs more of that. It's probably the one thing I've learned in more than 5 years at USAID was just the power of personal relationships in driving our success. And during my first week on the job, the Haiti earthquake, in an instant, led to more than 250,000 people losing their lives in what is one of the greatest tragedies in human history. And we mounted a massive and immediate large-scale response. And from that moment on, I had the opportunity to be in contact with people, and I saw that whether you were Republican or Democrat in the House or the Senate, elected or not, people reached out and said, we want to help. We have people in our constituencies that want to help. And you could sort of see America's values play out in that Haiti response. And so we really just kept building on those relationships over the course of time, and I traveled with Senator Inhofe and a group of pretty conservative Republican members of the House and Senate through Ethiopia. I've traveled to districts around the country and states around the country with Lindsey Graham and with Thad Cochran and so many others. And that's, I think, how you build relationships. And what I saw was that their caring and commitment for this agenda was very genuine. It came from a very deep place. They were persistent and committed. And so long as we were demonstrating a business-like focus on results, a very serious management approach to accountability, we would, in fact, continue to earn greater support. And it helped us rebuild U.S. aid. We increased our staff size and budgets considerably after almost 2 decades of decline. It helped us create a science and technology and innovation platform called the U.S. Global Development Lab that now connects dozens of technology companies around the country with some of the most challenging problems we face around the world. And it's helped us create new networks of university students and institutes that are working with USAID to help end extreme poverty or promote democracy in some of the toughest places in the world.
So do you feel that there's a national consensus now around some of the core issues that you're working on? And then in the areas where you're working now, is there competition from other countries? And is it competition? Is China working in some of the same areas, and are you working cooperatively, say, with China, or do you feel that it's more competitive in nature? How is that working out today?
Well, those are both great questions. I do think there's a national consensus amongst those who have a more foreign policy orientation that says that if we tackle some of the challenges of extreme poverty and extreme fragility around the world and protect the world's most vulnerable people, that America will be stronger and more prosperous over time. But I would say it's still in a small cohort of people who are thinking on an international basis, and we have much more to do to broaden that consensus. With respect to competition, I do think the competition is fierce and intense, and you're very right to point out that for the last 15 years, for example, China has really dramatically increased its commercial development and humanitarian-oriented investments and partnerships in places like Africa and throughout Asia. And that's why President Obama launched Power Africa to help produce a more Western and transparent model of investment and support so that American companies could compete on a level playing field and we could achieve some extraordinary outcomes like bringing 500 million people in sub-Saharan Africa who still live without adequate access to power and electricity and light benefit from being connected to a modern global economy. And what I was surprised by is that countries around the world, even with this strong competitive approach, prefer working with America. They prefer American standards, American companies, American brands, and American values. So we have to be out there fighting for it. Otherwise, we will cede the ground to many other models, including China, Russia, Brazil, so many other countries that are taking a more international view to their own economic development.
Well, one thing that's often said is that the groups like Boko Haram do a better job at social services than some of the governments. Do you believe that, or is that something that is just kind of, one of those things that's just false advertising for a very bad group?
I think it's mostly false advertising. We have seen, unfortunately, the Boko Harams, the Talibans, the Al-Qaedas of the world. They can establish very quick administrative capability in places because they don't really respect human rights. They violate the rights and the humanity of women and girls. They tend to put in place justice systems that deliver justice quickly, but it's really not justice. It's a harsh form and interpretation of their own skewed and disastrous worldview. And so they can create the semblance of stability, but they're really not serving the populations, in particular women and girls, in any sort of human or moral manner. And I think that's another area where, as our foreign policy advances over the years, we ought to have more bipartisan support. The members on both sides of the aisle feel passionately, and I saw this when I was part of the National Prayer Breakfast a few years ago, feel passionately that American values should be reaching these communities and should be a part of how we show the world that we stand for something exceptional, we stand for something just, and these other violent extremist groups that terrorize populations, frankly, do not.
Well, Dr. Shah, it has been a pleasure having you on here. You have left a very high standard at USAID for what you've accomplished and what you set out to do, and I'm glad to know you and to know that you're going to be continuing to serve both in the private sector and the public life for many years to come, because we need that moral standard and those partnerships that you have built to continue for many years to come as well. So look forward to having you back on the show sometime soon. Thank you. You are listening to No